Have you ever driven down a lonely highway late at night? The road stretching endlessly ahead, the dark swallowing everything behind you. Your headlights are the only thing cutting through the pitch-black night, and the silence is so heavy, it feels like even the universe is holding its breath. Now imagine you're not alone. Highways may seem like simple pathways to get from one place to another, but they carry with them untold stories, eerie whispers of the past, chilling encounters that defy logic, and terrifying events that people swear are real. Tonight, we're going to explore some of the most bone-chilling tales from the open road. These aren't just urban legends or campfire stories. These are accounts that people have experienced, first-hand stories that will make you think twice before taking that late-night drive. But here's the thing, the truth behind these tales remains a mystery. Were they figments of overactive imaginations, coincidences, or could they be something far darker than we're ready to accept? In this video, we'll dive deep into 4 haunting stories that happened on highways, just like the ones you've driven on. From ghostly hitchhikers to malevolent forces lurking in the shadows, each story will leave you questioning what's real and what might be waiting for you on your next road trip. So buckle up, turn down the lights, and get ready to experience the kind of fear that clings to your bones. These are the creepy highway horror stories you absolutely need to hear. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a chilly autumn evening when David, a seasoned long-haul truck driver, found himself navigating a desolate highway in the Midwest. The air outside was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant rain. Tall, leafless trees lined the road, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind as though waving him onward. David glanced at his dashboard clock. It read 2:13 a.m., the dead of night when the world seemed eerily still. He rubbed his eyes and stretched his neck, trying to fend off the creeping fatigue. The silence of the night pressed against the windows, broken only by the soft purr of his truck's engine. He reached for the radio dial, tuning into an old country station. The familiar twang of a guitar filled the cab, momentarily cutting through the oppressive quiet. He thought of the coffee thermos sitting in the cup holder, but even the promise of caffeine felt like too much effort. Just as he began to relax into the monotony of the drive, something up ahead caught his eye. A figure stood by the shoulder of the road, barely illuminated by his headlights. David squinted, unsure if he was imagining things. But as the truck rolled closer, the figure became clearer, a young woman, no older than her mid-20s, standing perfectly still. She wore a flowing white dress that seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders in loose waves, partially obscuring her pale face. Her arms hung limply by her sides, except for one that raised slightly, as though she were signaling for help. But what struck David the most was her expression. Wide eyes filled with a desperate sadness, the kind that seemed to reach out and pull at his heart. David's instincts screamed at him not to stop. Hitchhikers, especially at this hour, were bad news. He'd heard enough horror stories from his fellow truckers to know better. But something about her gave him pause. Against his better judgment, he slowed down, his truck's brakes hissing as it came to a halt. The gravel under his tires crunched loudly, almost unnaturally so in the quiet night. As he rolled down the passenger side window, the woman stepped closer. Her bare feet made no sound against the asphalt, and her movements were strangely deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made David lean closer to hear. "Can you take me to Ridgway?" she asked. "I need to get home." David hesitated. Ridgway was a small town about 10 miles down the road, not far from his route. He glanced at her again, her frail frame and trembling. Hands gave her the appearance of someone who had been through more than they could bear. Against the nagging voice in his head telling him to drive away, he nodded. "Sure," he said, "hop in." As she climbed into the truck, David felt a sudden chill that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He reached for the heater, cranking it higher, but the cold persisted. The woman sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap, staring straight ahead. David tried to make conversation. "So what happened?" he asked gently. "Your car break down?" Her reply was clipped, almost mechanical. "I just need to get home," she said. Her voice carried no emotion, and her gaze remained fixed on the road. David decided not to press further. The drive was tense. The faint glow of the dashboard cast eerie shadows across the cab, making her expression hard to read. David couldn't help but glance at her occasionally, noticing how still she was, unnaturally so. Her breathing, if it existed, was imperceptible. Even the air around her felt heavy, as though it resisted his presence. As they neared Ridgeway, the woman's demeanor changed. She began fidgeting, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. Her body tensed, and for the first time, she turned to look at him. Her wide, hollow eyes sent a shiver down his spine. "It's just a little further," she murmured, her voice shaking. Finally, they arrived at the address she had given him, a small, dilapidated house at the end of a deserted street. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were dark, as though the place hadn't been lived in for years. David stopped the truck and turned to tell her they had arrived. But when he looked, the passenger seat was empty. A cold wave of panic surged through him. He looked around the cab, then out the window, but there was no sign of her. The passenger door hadn't opened. He would have heard it. She had simply vanished. Trembling, he climbed out of the truck and approached the house. The gravel driveway crunched loudly under his boots, but the rest of the world seemed eerily silent. David knocked on the door, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. After a moment, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman appeared. Her frail frame was wrapped in a worn cardigan, and her face bore an expression of both curiosity and exhaustion. "Can I help you?" she asked. David hesitated, then explained what had happened, describing the young woman he had picked up. As he spoke, the woman's expression changed. Her face grew pale, and her eyes filled with tears. "That's my daughter," she said, her voice trembling. "But she's been gone for over a decade." David stared at her in disbelief. She went on to explain that her daughter had died in a car accident on that very stretch of highway. Every year, on the Bay anniversary of her death, locals reported seeing her hitchhiking along the road. "She just wanted to come home," the woman whispered, wiping her tears. "She always loved this house." Shaken to his core, David stumbled back to his truck. As he climbed into the cab, he noticed something on the passenger seat, a faint imprint, as though someone had been sitting there. The chill lingered, along with the faint scent of damp earth and wildflowers. The rest of his drive was a blur, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a haunting melody. For years, David would share the story of the vanishing hitchhiker. Some believed him, others dismissed it as a tall tale. But David knew the truth. He had encountered something unexplainable, something that blurred the fragile line between the living and the dead. The phantom truck. For decades, truckers have traded chilling stories of a phantom truck, a massive, ghostly semi that appears without warning, haunting deserted highways. Unlike the trucks that share the road every day, this one doesn't just drive. It hunts. Drivers describe it as a relentless force, chasing them down, forcing them to the brink of disaster. Skeptics dismiss these stories as the product of sleepless nights and overactive imaginations. But for those who have faced it, the terror is all too real. One such encounter happened to Jake, a seasoned long-haul driver. With years of experience navigating the country's loneliest highways, Jake considered himself unshakable. But nothing could have prepared him for what he experienced one stormy night in the Arizona desert. The evening began like any other. Jake was hauling industrial equipment along Highway 84, a remote stretch of road that cut through the barren desert landscape. The storm had passed earlier, leaving the highway damp and the air heavy with the scent of wet sand. Overhead, thick clouds obscured the stars and moon, plunging the world into an unsettling darkness. Glancing at the clock, Jake noted the time, 12:08 am. He still had hours to go before his next stop. Adjusting his grip on the wheel, he tuned the radio to a local station playing soft blues. The familiar melodies offered some comfort as he navigated the endless, empty highway. But despite the music, an inexplicable unease settled over him. The silence outside felt too heavy. Jake shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. He reached for his thermos, took a long sip of lukewarm coffee and focused on the road. That's when he saw two faint pinpricks of light in his rearview mirror. Headlights. At first, Jake felt relieved. Another vehicle meant he wasn't completely alone out here. But his relief quickly turned to unease. The lights were erratic, flickering in and out as they drew closer. Whoever was behind him wasn't driving normally. Jake squinted, trying to make out the vehicle's shape in the mirror, but all he could see were those glaring lights, growing brighter by the second. The truck came into view, a massive semi with an imposing grille and headlights that burned brighter than any Jake had ever seen. It closed the distance with unnerving speed, its engine growling like a living beast. Jake instinctively tapped the accelerator, urging his rig to move faster. But no matter how much speed he gained, the phantom truck stayed on his tail. Jake's heart pounded as he reached for his CB radio. His voice trembled as he called out, "This is Jake, eastbound on Highway 84. Anyone out there? I've got a truck tailgating me, and it's real close. Over." Static crackled in response. Jake tried again, his voice more frantic this time. "Anyone? This guy's gonna run me off the road." No answer. Suddenly, the phantom truck veered to the left, pulling up alongside Jake's rig. He glanced out his window, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The other truck's windows were completely black opaque, as if no light could penetrate them. But through the darkness, Jake thought he saw movement. A shadowy figure sat behind the wheel, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. Then its face turned toward him, red eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Jake's blood ran cold. His instincts screamed at him to escape. He slammed his foot on the gas, the engine of his truck roaring as he pushed it to its limits. The phantom truck matched his speed effortlessly, its massive grille glinting in the faint light. It swerved suddenly, cutting Jake off and forcing him toward the shoulder. His tires screeched as he fought to keep control, his trailer fishtailing dangerously. The road became a blur as Jake's panic took hold. He honked his horn repeatedly, flashing his high beams in a desperate attempt to deter the relentless truck. But it was no use. The phantom seemed to revel in his fear, swerving closer and closer with each passing moment. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Then, without warning, the phantom truck's headlights vanished. Jake slammed on his brakes, his rig skidding to a stop. The highway ahead was empty, stretching out into the dark void. For a moment, he sat frozen, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a hallucination? A trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion? He climbed out of his cab, his legs shaky beneath him. The cool desert air hit his face, and he inhaled deeply, trying to calm his racing heart. That's when he saw them, two deep gouges in the asphalt, running parallel to where his truck had stopped. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen, as though something impossibly heavy had torn through the road at high speed. The marks stretched into the distance, disappearing into the darkness. Jake shivered and climbed back into his cab, locking the doors behind him. The rest of the drive passed in a haze. He kept glancing in his mirrors, half expecting the phantom truck to reappear. But it never did. For years, Jake kept the story to himself, unsure if anyone would believe him. When he finally shared it with other drivers, he was met with knowing glances and murmurs of agreement. Many had encountered the phantom truck on Highway 84, each story eerily similar. Some claimed it was the spirit of a driver who had died in a crash decades ago, cursed to haunt the road for eternity. Others believed it was a warning, a harbinger of death for reckless drivers. Jake didn't know what to believe. All he knew was that the memory of that night would haunt him forever. The phantom truck wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was out there, waiting for its next victim. The highway shadow highways have always been a place of mystery. By day, they hum with life, connecting towns, cities, and people. But at night, when the roads are empty and the world is quiet, they transform into something entirely different. Darkness shrouds them, and the mind begins to play tricks. But for some drivers, the things they see aren't tricks, they're real. One such story comes from a woman named Claire, a traveling nurse who often took night shifts in rural areas. On one of her assignments, she found herself driving along a lonely highway in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a route she had driven many times before, a twisting, scenic road that wound through dense forests. But this time was different. This time, she wouldn't forget what she encountered. The clock on her dashboard read 3:07 a.m. when it happened. Claire was halfway through her journey, the headlights of her compact car cutting through the dense fog that had settled over the road. Her radio played softly in the background, a comforting distraction from the oppressive silence outside. Then, just ahead, something caught her eye. A shadow, faint at first, darted across the road. Claire instinctively slowed down, her foot hovering over the brake. At first, she thought it might be a deer common in these parts, but there was something odd about its movement. It wasn't running. It seemed to glide. Curious and unnerved, Claire eased her car forward, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The fog seemed thicker now, swirling like smoke around her car. Her heart pounded as her eyes scanned the road for the shadow. Then, suddenly, it appeared again, this time, directly in her path. The figure was humanoid but wrong. It stood unnaturally still in the center of the road, its outline hazy and indistinct. It was as if it were made of the fog itself. Claire slammed on the brakes, her car skidding slightly on the wet pavement. She stared, her breath caught in her throat. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move. Claire sat frozen, her eyes locked on the figure in her headlights. Its outline shimmered faintly, as if it were more a suggestion of a person than anything solid. Her logical mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, the fog playing games with her vision. But, deep down, she knew this wasn't normal. Her trembling hand moved to the gear shift, ready to reverse, when the figure suddenly moved, not walking, but sliding unnaturally toward the side of the road. It was there one moment and gone the next, swallowed by the dense fog. Claire's chest tightened as she strained to see where it had gone. The road ahead was clear, but her instincts screamed at her to turn back. But Claire wasn't one to spook easily. With a deep breath, she convinced herself to keep going. "It's nothing," she whispered aloud, as if saying it would make it true. She pressed on, her car crawling forward at a cautious speed. The radio, once a source of comfort, now felt intrusive. She reached over and switched it off, plunging the car into an eerie silence. The fog seemed to thicken with every mile. The trees that lined the highway disappeared into the gray void, their gnarled branches occasionally poking through like skeletal hands. The beams of her headlights caught glimpses of the road ahead, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just beyond their reach. Then it happened again. The shadow appeared suddenly, this time on the shoulder of the road. It was closer now, just outside the range of her headlights, but unmistakable. It hovered there, as though waiting. Claire's breath hitched as her pulse raced. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. It was something else. She kept driving, her foot pressing harder on the gas as her anxiety grew. The shadow didn't follow her, or at least, she thought it didn't, but a growing feeling of unease weighed on her, like she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and every nerve in her body screamed for her to get away. Several miles passed without incident. Claire allowed herself a shaky sigh of relief, but just as she began to think she was in the clear, her headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road again, directly in her path. This time it was closer than before, and clearer. It had no features, no face, no clothing. It was a solid black silhouette, darker than the surrounding night. It seemed to absorb the light from her headlights, leaving no reflection. Her car screeched to a halt mere feet from the figure, the tires sliding on the damp road. Claire gripped the wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stood there, completely still, blocking her way. "Forward. Who are you? What do you want?" she shouted, her voice breaking. The shadow tilted its head slightly, as if studying her. Then, with a sudden unnatural jerk, it darted to the side of the road, disappearing into the fog once more. Claire's hands shook as she slammed the car into reverse. She didn't care where she ended up. She just needed to get away. Her tires spun as she turned the car around and sped back the way she came, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't look in the mirrors. She didn't want to know if it was following her. The drive back was a blur of fear and adrenaline. By the time she reached the safety of a small gas station at the edge of town, her entire body was trembling. She stumbled out of the car and into the bright, fluorescent lights of the station, desperate to feel grounded in reality again. The attendant looked up from his newspaper as she approached, her face pale and eyes wide. "You okay, miss?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Claire tried to explain what she had seen, but her words came out jumbled. The shadow, the fog, the way it seemed to move without moving. The attendant's expression shifted from concern to something else, recognition. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly, leaning closer. "The shadow." Claire stared at him, stunned. "You know about it?" He nodded slowly. "A few folks have mentioned seeing something like that on this highway. Always at night, always in the fog. Some say it's a spirit. Others think it's something worse. But whatever it is, you're lucky you got away." Those words stuck with Claire long after she left the gas station. She never drove that highway at night again, and every time she saw fog rolling in, her heart skipped a beat. To this day, she can't explain what she saw that night. But one thing is certain, the shadow wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. The rest stop, haunting rest stops are meant to be places of safety, a momentary haven for travelers to refuel, stretch, and continue their journey. But late at night, when the world is quiet and shadows stretch long under flickering lights, these mundane spaces can take on an ominous edge. For truckers who spend countless hours navigating lonely highways, rest stops are sometimes more than just eerie, they're haunted. Mark, an experienced driver, would come to learn this firsthand on a cold December night. Mark had been driving for hours. His logbook showed that he'd been on the road since mid-morning, with only a short break to refuel. Now the rhythmic hum of his rig and the faint vibrations of the road beneath him were lulling him into a dangerous state of drowsiness. The dark highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by his high beams. When he spotted the faint glow of a rest stop sign in the distance, he felt a wave of relief. He needed to stretch his legs and grab some shut-eye before continuing his route. The rest area came into view as Mark pulled off the highway. It wasn't much, a small lot surrounded by trees, with a dimly lit restroom building and a few abandoned vending machines near the entrance. The air felt heavy as he parked his truck near the edge of the lot, where a single lamppost flickered weakly. A few scattered cars dotted the area, their windows fogged over. There were no signs of life. Mark turned off the engine and sat for a moment, letting the silence wash over him. The lot was eerily still, the faint buzz of the lamppost the only sound. He grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat and stepped out of the truck. The cold hit him immediately, sharper than he'd expected, biting at his exposed skin. He zipped up his jacket and began walking toward the restroom building. As he approached, he noticed how dilapidated the structure looked. The paint was peeling, and the windows were streaked with grime. A faint glow seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up door, hinting at a dim light source inside. Mark hesitated for a moment, his gut instinct telling him to turn back, but exhaustion pushed him forward. The restroom door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the empty space. Inside, the air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang that made Mark wrinkle his nose. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows across the graffiti-covered walls and cracked tiles. Mark moved to the sink, splashing cold water on his face in an attempt to wake himself up. He glanced into the mirror and froze. Just behind him, in the reflection, stood a shadowy figure. His breath caught in his throat as his body went rigid. The figure didn't move. It was indistinct, almost like smoke, but its outline was unmistakable, a person standing just a few feet away. Heart pounding, Mark spun around, but the restroom was empty. The door was still closed, and the only sound was the faint hum of the lights. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's nothing," he muttered aloud, his voice shaky. Just my imagination." He hurried out of the restroom, the door slamming shut behind him. The parking lot felt darker than before. The lampposts cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward him as he walked. He quickened his pace, his eyes darting nervously around the lot. Every creak and rustle of the wind made his pulse spike. By the time he reached his truck, he was practically jogging. Mark climbed into the cab and locked the doors, his hands trembling. He sat there for a moment, trying to convince himself it was all in his head. But as he reached for his thermos, a loud thud against the passenger side door made him jump. His head snapped toward the window, and his breath caught in his throat. There, pressed against the fogged-up glass, was a hand. The hand was pale and unnaturally thin. Its long, bony fingers splayed out as though trying to push through the glass. Mark stared in horror as the hand began to slide downward, leaving streaks of condensation in its wake. He fumbled with his keys, his fingers shaking so badly it took him several tries to start the engine. The hand disappeared as soon as the engine roared to life, but Mark didn't wait to see if it would return. He threw the truck into gear and sped out of the lot, his tires screeching against the pavement. Gravel sprayed behind him as the rest stop faded into the darkness. As Mark merged back onto the highway, the events of the night weighed heavily on his mind. But as the miles stretched on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His mirrors reflected only the empty road behind him, yet the sensation of being watched grew stronger with every passing moment. He tightened his grip on the wheel, his eyes darting between the horizon and the rearview mirror. The highway felt endless, a black ribbon unspooling into the void. For the first time in his career, Mark questioned whether he should continue driving or find another spot to pull over. But the thought of stopping again filled him with dread. That hand on the glass, the shadow in the mirror, the figure in the parking lot. He couldn't risk another encounter. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to bleed into the night, something caught his eye. In the distance, a faint outline appeared in the middle of the road. At first, he thought it might be a fallen branch or debris from an accident. But as he got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a figure, a person, standing, motionless in the center of the highway. Mark's heart raced as he slowed the truck. His headlights illuminated the figure fully, now a woman in a white dress, her long hair obscuring her face. She stood with her arms at her sides, unmoving, as if she were waiting for him. Mark slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck came to a jarring halt just a few feet from the figure, but when he blinked, she was gone. His hands trembled as he scanned the road ahead. There was no sign of her, no movement, no shadow, just the empty highway stretching endlessly before him. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. As he reached for his thermos, the passenger seat creaked under an invisible weight. And there you have it, 4 chilling tales from the open road that remind us just how mysterious and unsettling highways can be after dark. From the desperate spirit of a vanishing hitchhiker to the relentless pursuit of a phantom truck, the eerie shadow that haunts foggy highways, and the terrifying encounter at a rest stop. These stories blur the line between the real and the unexplainable. The road holds countless stories, and for every one we've shared tonight, there are dozens more left untold. So the next time you find yourself alone on a dark stretch of highway, or stopping at a quiet rest area late at night, take a moment to listen to the whispers in the wind, to the faint sounds that don't quite belong. Who knows? You might just find yourself at the center of the next story. If you enjoyed these tales and want to hear more, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more chilling stories from the road and beyond. And if you've experienced something strange or unexplainable on the road, share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. Stay safe out there, travelers. And remember, sometimes the scariest thing about the road is what you can't see.